Africa is facing a different situation where they have to now determine whether they're going to become an independent nation, even though they are a nation, no longer reliant on Europe to provide for them, to provide them all of what they have, because the resources they do have is being taken away to Europe, and Europe, of course, gets the majority of the returns and benefits more than anyone else in the continent of Africa. That's the issue. They want independence. They want to move away from that and stand on their own, make their own decision, and control their own resources. However, the problem is more than what it appears to be. You see, those people that want these nations in Africa to be independent, they're in a position where they have to make a decision as to how this independence will come to realization. Right now, the European nations are pressuring the African nations to go along with the Europeans to go to war against these new leaders throughout the continent of Africa that have ousted the elected officials, because those elected officials are basically allowing the other countries in Europe to get 95% of the resources, and the continent of Africa keeps 5%. And that's the issue. They overthrew those elected officials who will be actually corrupt elected officials. And now the ones who have not been overthrown are gathering with Europe throughout the whole European nations, who are wanting to keep the 95% benefit of the resources of Africa. They're the ones that allow the government to give those resources at 95%, and the continent gets only 5%, making those elected officials like presidents billionaires and their people squalor. Now, the overthrow is based on that premise. However, it's not that easy, because the European Union is working together along with NATO to allow the Europeans to gather African countries that are still aligned with them, to use their military to go to war against their own African brothers and sisters who want independence away from Europe. And that's the most complexity of the issues, because now these African countries are being used to fight each other to benefit, of course, on the side of the West, the European nations. That is the goal. However, the problem is far more complex than that. We're going to go into details how this is happening. So I'm going to give you some comparisons as to what's happening today in the world society. Today in America, Black people are facing many atrocities. They're facing many problems. And as of August the 5th, Black people have begun to wake up, realize, we can actually do things on our own. We don't necessarily have to depend on the Black Panthers. We don't have to depend on civil rights organizations. We don't have to depend on any organization. We could rise on our own and achieve on our own. And August 5th, the rescue of August 5th, was just a small portion of what our capabilities are if we actually put ourselves focused on what our goals are. And it was very clear what happened in August 5th. Now the issue is, can that be sustained? That depends on the efforts that we put into it. Now, here in America, the issue is primarily always financial. Unbeknownst to most of our people, they're living in a society where they're receiving a third of what everyone receives when it comes to finances. So they're allowing you to think that reparations is the key, a one-time payment for whatever that amount happens to be. It's nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to the funds that they have been squandering out of your pockets. That's right, out of your own pockets, by allowing you to focus on employment that allows you to only achieve 1/3 of your true value. That's right, 1/3. So when you think about reparations, surely it is attractive. However, when you think about what your true value is, it surpasses it. And it's been going on for all these centuries. It hasn't stopped. It's not going to change at all unless our people make a difference. Just like what's happening in Africa. Now, here's the issue that's at hand when it comes to Africa. It impacts everyone, because the big issue about Africa, the resources that are being battled over and being challenged, are the greatest and most significant resources in the whole planet. That's right. The biggest concern, sure, it is gold and of course diamonds, but there's something even greater than gold and diamonds in this current world, and that's defense, security for a nation. And how is that attained in today's world at the highest level? Through nuclear weapons. And how a nuclear weapon is designed? The number one component and mineral for nuclear weapons is uranium. And that's what the issue is happening in Africa. The uranium. Because of that, these nations are willing to go to war against those African countries that no longer wants to give them uranium. That's right. So now they have to face a very difficult situation, because now they're going to use their own African nations in their continent to go to war against them to benefit the Europeans who desperately need their own uranium. And that's the big issue. However, what people don't realize, that all of this that's happening in Africa didn't just pop out of anywhere. This was all well planned, orchestrated to where it is today. It didn't just happen overnight. And no, it was no organization that made this happen. It was not the Eastern organizations that made it happen. All of this points to one particular individual that orchestrated this. Now, clearly, we understand the war that's taking place in Ukraine, and Ukraine is going to war against basically Russia. But Russia is going to war against Ukraine, that truly represents not themselves, but the entire NATO organization. 30 nations, including the United States. That's who they're actually going to war, through a proxy against Russia. NATO is at war with Russia at this point. And now, Putin has come up with a great plan to make things possible for his purpose. What he has done, he has spoken to all the leadership in Africa and told them, whatever you owe us financially, he has forgiven everything. Everything that was ever owed to Russia by Africa has been totally forgiven in terms of what they owe them financially. It's opened up the door. And now they're giving guidance and directions to the African nations that don't want to give their resources to the European Union or NATO or America. Now that creates a big bundle, because now Africa is in the midst of a war that they didn't even start. A war in which Putin is now gaining the support of Africans, and throughout many countries in Africa, you will see Africans waving Russian flags, making parades with Russian flags. Why they're having parades and Russian flags? Because of the support that they're going to get from Putin, going against, of course, NATO and America, and not giving them their resources. So even though those African countries are talking about becoming an independent nation, meaning not depending on anyone else, it's beginning to look like they are becoming dependent just to a different group of people or a particular man. This in case, we're talking about Russia. Russia is preparing itself to garner all these African nations that are siding with him, giving them the same military support, just like America and, of course, NATO are preparing to go to war in Africa against the Africans. And what greater response can that happen for Russia? Russia is now fighting 30 nations in the Ukraine. It hasn't been resolved for over a year. And now that big problem that he has in his country, he is now presenting the same problem to NATO. NATO is now going to have to deal with fighting African nations. Not just fighting them, but fighting for their lives, fighting for their resources. They're not going to receive their diamonds. They're not going to receive their gold. They're not going to receive their uranium. Now they have a bigger problem to face against these Africans. And that's going to take a war for them to solve it and win. And now they have to spend more money than what they're sending to the Ukraine. So they're spending money into the Ukraine, and now they got to spend money to fight against the Russians in Africa through a proxy war. Of course, the Russians are not going to fight, but the Africans are going to fight for Russia. And they're going to be sending more money to fight the Russians in Africa. So Americans, be prepared. Not only are you sending billions to Ukraine, you're going to be sending even bigger billions, because now the war in Africa is about primarily one issue: uranium. Without uranium, you cannot rule the world. And that's the goal that's taking place. And now Putin is now going to lay back and watch America, and of course NATO, having to suffer of a war that they didn't anticipate to have, and now they have less resources to defend themselves. If they start using nuclear weapons, every time you use one up, you have to replace it. But how are you going to do that when your resources are depleted? Just like what they did to Russia not long ago. They blew up the pipeline of oil into Europe. That means, of course, Russia had less funds because of it. The same thing's going to happen in America and throughout NATO when they realize they could only produce so many nuclear weapons. And who has the most nuclear weapons on the planet? Russia. All planned by one man, Putin. Prepare ourselves. If we're really going to form an independent nation, we have to start thinking beyond all of this and stand on our own. Use your resources to your benefit. Don't allow others to manipulate you into what they're involved in and giving you the kindness, the good ear, the good speeches, but producing zero results for your people. It's time for us to form our nation here in America and be an independent nation, learning from this process, becoming greater, and doing more for our people than we've ever had. And the new nation that we're creating, the great nation of Mahali. Join us.